Well, as Lynn mentioned just now, we're about in the holiday season now. I think the schools break up in about 10 days' time, something like that. And Lynn and I are going on holiday tomorrow afternoon. Isn't that cool? I was chatting to Alan Stevens in the church office a couple of weeks ago, and he said, I hope you guys have a great holiday. You and Lynn really need a good rest. And we also ran into Chris and Ruth Hudson as well. And every time we see them, without fail, Chris will always say to me in his very gentle and very kindly way, are you getting enough rest? Every time I see him, he says, it's his first question, are you and Lynn getting enough rest? And just recently, Lynn and I have been reflecting on that quite a lot because church for us is always very, very busy. The first year in a leadership transition is always a very important one, and we've been trying to work very hard at it. I checked in our diaries last week, and in the last month, one or both of us has been busy 24 out of the last 28 evenings. Now, as you may know, Lynn is full-time in the church, and I work half the week in Vineyard and half the week in the city, which is why at the moment neither of us take any salary from the church. We support ourselves with my part-time job. I'm what Vineyard calls bivocational, which I thought was a very, very cute term until somebody told me that it means doing two jobs badly. Now, obviously, Sundays is a working day for us as well, because we often have an evening event and sometimes an afternoon event, as well as doing church on a Sunday morning. And quite often we're doing stuff on Saturdays too. So as we were talking about this, Lynn said to me, do you realize that in our own ways, we're both workaholics? And my immediate thought was, that's nonsense. We're not workaholics. But bitter past experience has shown me that Lynn is usually right. So I started to think and pray about this a bit more, and I did a bit of research. There's an organization called Workaholics Anonymous, which is modeled on Alcoholics Anonymous. And on their website, they have a checklist of 20 questions under the heading, how do I know if I'm a workaholic? And I was delighted to find that I could only answer yes to 12 out of the 20 questions. But then I saw the small print at the bottom where it says you're a workaholic if you've answered yes to 3 or more. So here are some examples. Do you work more than 40 hours a week? Yes. Do you believe it's okay to work long hours if you love what you're doing? Yes. Do you think about your work while driving or watching TV or falling asleep? Yes. Are you afraid that if you don't work hard, you might be a failure? Ouch. Yes. Guilty as charged. Now, one of the things that surprised me as I was answering these questions is that when I was working full-time in the city, I was never your stereotypical businessman workaholic. I would have answered the questions then completely differently. So finding myself saying yes to them in relation to doing church work was more than a bit discouraging. So how did I miss it? Well, one reason is because Lynn and I have never thought of serving in church as work. Serving for us is a passion, not a chore. Serving is what Jesus did. Serving is what we love doing. And perhaps it's because we've spent most of our church life serving as volunteers, we've always been really sensitive to the fact that most of the church are doing all their serving on evenings and weekends, as well as doing demanding day jobs. So Lynn and I have always wanted to be setting an example. And hopefully you'll never see us asking anyone to do anything that we're not willing to do ourselves. But all of this got me thinking and praying about what God was saying to us about this subject of rest. And because we're evangelicals who recognize the Bible as God's living word, we always want to look to what God's saying to us through the Bible at the same time we're listening for what he might be saying to us in our heads and our hearts. So we need to have a both-and approach to hearing from God, speaking through Scripture as well as the other ways that he communicates to us, not either or. And that's because anything that we feel or sense that God may be saying now will never be inconsistent with what he's already said in the Bible. Now that doesn't mean searching the Bible to find a proof text. It means testing what we feel God is saying, as the Bible itself tells us we should do, to be sure that it's consistent with God's nature and character and purposes, as those are revealed in the Bible, and consistent with what God says generally on things in similar situations and similar subjects. So the more that we know the Bible, the more good material God has got to work with in us when he speaks to us, helping us to hear what he's saying and to hear it right. Anyway, so as I was praying about what God might be saying about rest, the first verse that popped into my head was this, Hebrews 4:9. So then, a Sabbath rest still remains for the people of God. A Sabbath rest still remains for the people of God. How interesting. I wonder what that means. And that's what we're going to explore together in a little Bible study this morning. Now, as I've said many times, whenever you want to know the meaning of any Bible text, the first place to start is the context. Context stops us making wrong assumptions about individual verses that are plucked from here and there and read in isolation. One of the first things that a theology student is told is that a text taken out of its context is a pretext. That's why so-called proof texting, taking individual verses out of their context and using them to prove something that you as a speaker want to say, is easily leads at least to bad Bible teaching. So what do we mean by context? Well, the context of a verse includes several things. The passages around it, which is chapters 3 and 4 in this case, the book that it's in, that we call Hebrews, where it is in the Bible, Hebrews is in the New Testament, the nature of the book, the type of literature that it is. In this case, it's a pastoral letter written to one of the early churches, who it was written by and to and why, the situation facing the original audience for that letter, and so on. So we want to start by listening for how the earliest readers would have understood it, the people to whom it was originally addressed, as well as what God's wanting to say through it to us today. So once again, we're looking for a both and. So, to practice what we preach, or to practice what I'm preaching, let's quickly look at the context to help us figure out what God's saying to us in this verse, Hebrews 4:9. Now, Hebrews is a fascinating book because unlike most of the New Testament letters, which were written to particular churches in a city or a region, we don't know who Hebrews was written to. The full title of the book in the Greek manuscripts is actually To the Hebrews, which is not surprising because we can see from the content that it was obviously written to a very Jewish congregation. The intended audience for this letter was very familiar with the Old Testament, and no other book in the New Testament has more Old Testament references than Hebrews, and quite often a person or an event is simply mentioned in passing without the writer explaining its context or its relevance. So the writer obviously expected his audience to know their Old Testament and to know their Jewish history. The best guess of the Bible scholars, by the way, is that it was written by Apollos, who features in Acts and 1 Corinthians, and that it was probably written to the Jewish Christian community in Rome. So let's have a quick look at the surrounding context of Hebrews 4, which will help us to find out a bit more about this Sabbath rest that still remains for the people of God. And I'm going to use the New Living Translation. We're going to read some verses from Hebrews 4, starting at verse 1. And as we do, I would like you to listen out for something. I'd like you to look for the verse that we just read, a Sabbath rest still remains for the people of God. So, Hebrews 4, starting at verse 1. God's promise of entering his rest still stands. So we ought to tremble with fear that some of you might fail to experience it. For this good news that God has prepared this rest has been announced to us just as it was to them. And the them that he's talking about here are the people of Israel, who God set free from slavery in Egypt and led them on a journey to the promised land that we call the Exodus. But it did them no good because they didn't combine what they heard with faith. For only we who believe can enter his rest. As for the others, God said, in my anger I took an oath. They will never enter my place of rest, even though this rest has been ready since he made the world. We know it is ready because of the place in the scriptures where it mentions the seventh day. That's Genesis 2. You can forgive him being a bit vague about it because the Bible didn't have chapter numbers until the Middle Ages. On the seventh day, God rested from all his work. So God's rest is there for people to enter. But those who first heard this good news failed to enter because they disobeyed God. So God set another time for entering his rest, and that time is today. Now, if Joshua had succeeded in giving them this rest, God would not have spoken about another day of rest still to come. So, there is a special rest still waiting for the people of God. For all who have entered into God's rest have rested from their labors, just as God did after creating the world. So let us do our best to enter that rest. Okay, so quite a long passage with lots of things about this rest that God has for us, including lots of allusions from the Old Testament. And the Old Testament passage that the writer is mostly quoting from here is Psalm 95. And Psalm 95 describes how the generation that left Egypt failed to enter God's rest in a different sense to what he's talking about in this chapter. Most of the generation who left Egypt lived their entire lives in the wilderness without entering into that other place of rest that God intended for them. Because they doubted God and disobeyed God, the journey to the promised land took them 40 years instead of just a few months. So they missed out on entering God's rest in the sense of coming into the promised land. And there's a picture in this, he's saying, that we need to learn from. So God speaking through giving us pictures is not just a Vineyard thing, it's a Bible thing. Israel failing to enter the rest that God had for them is a picture of the rest that God has for us, that some of us are in danger of missing out on, just like some of them did. Now, did you notice the phrase that I asked you to look out for a few moments ago? A Sabbath rest still remains for the people of God. It wasn't there. Or rather, it wasn't translated the same way. The New Living Translation translated it like this: there's a special rest still waiting for the people of God. And the reason is because of the original Greek word that's being translated. Remember that the New Testament was written in Greek because that was the universal language of the time, a bit like English is today. And that word is Sabbatismos. Now you can probably guess that it comes from the same root as Sabbath, which is the seventh day of the Jewish week when faithful Jews would do no work from Friday evening through to Saturday evening. But Sabbatismos isn't the Greek word for Sabbath. It's also obvious from the context that this word is talking about a kind of resting. But Sabbatismos isn't the Greek word for rest either. The fact is that this is the earliest known use of the word in any Greek literature. And it's also the only place in the New Testament that the word appears as well. So the Bible translators can't just translate it as Sabbath, and they can't just translate it as resting. It looks like the writer of the Hebrews has deliberately created a new word from something that's similar but different. A little bit like the way in which we've created a word for Facebooking someone. In other words, sending them a message via Facebook. And here he's using it to describe God's version of the Sabbath and God's version of resting, which he says God has been doing since the beginning of time, and in which he's now inviting us to join him. What we might call divine Sabbathing, maybe. Or as my spell checker tried to change it to, divine sunbathing. So no wonder the translators struggled to find a word for this Greek word, Sabbatismos. So what have we learned so far, very quickly? It's a special kind of rest that God has for his people. It's not like ordinary, everyday rest, putting your feet up. It's a bit like how you live on the Sabbath, but it's much more than that. And it's possible for some of us to be living in the good of that special rest now, but for some of us to be missing out. Okay, are you with me so far? Probably not a good question for a preacher to ask, but just in case, but let's keep going. Now, some people assume that what he's talking about here is going to heaven when you die. And there's definitely a sense in which heaven will give us a rest from the strife and the troubles and the sorrows of life in this world. But there's more to it than that, because Hebrews says this is good news that we can experience now. In verse 7, it says that the time for entering God's special rest is today. It's available to us now. You might think another possibility from this passage is that he's talking about the Jewish Sabbath, that he's saying that we as Christians should also do no work one day a week. Now, I think that's a great principle. I think it's really good to have at least a day a week off work, and there are lots of great health benefits from doing that. But that's not what he's saying either, because remember, he was writing to a Jewish audience who were already experiencing the Sabbath. They did it every week. And Psalm 95 that he quotes from says that this special rest was still to come, even though by the time the psalmist was writing, Israel had already been keeping the Sabbath for about 500 years. So these are some of the things that it's not. But what exactly is this special Sabbath-like rest that God has for us, that we can experience today? Now, to start with, did you notice how when the writer was talking about the people of Israel failing to enter their rest in the sense of the promised land, he said that Joshua wasn't able to give it to them? If you know the story of the Exodus, or you've seen the Prince of Egypt, you might have expected that he would say Moses, who led the people out of Egypt. The reason he says Joshua here is because Moses never made it into the promised land. Moses never experienced it, because Moses was part of the generation that died in the wilderness, and Joshua succeeded him. So Joshua led them into the promised land. But there's still a special kind of rest that God had for them that Joshua couldn't give. Okay, but there's something more to it than that. The reason that he name checks Joshua, which is hidden in the text here. Remember how I said the New Testament was written in Greek? The Greek word that translates both Joshua and Jesus is the same, Jesus. So his Greek-speaking Jewish audience would have immediately picked up on a contrast between Joshua, the Jesus of the Old Testament, who couldn't and didn't bring this special rest, and Jesus, the Jesus of the New Testament, who can and does. And we'll see in just a moment that it's Jesus who fulfills in us this promise of God's rest. And the last clue to this special rest in the Hebrews passage is in verses 3 and 4, where it says it's been made ready for us from the very beginning when God made the world. Genesis 1, the very first chapter of the Bible, tells us how God made the world and that he did it in 6 days. Now, whether you think that that is a literal 6 days or just a helpful way of picturing it for remembering and retelling the story to generation after generation of people who are living in an oral culture, it really doesn't matter. It says in 2 Peter 3 that with the Lord a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. So from his point of view, either way, God is not bothered. Whatever you think, it doesn't make you a heretic. You won't be in violation of any Christian doctrine or any of the creeds. But if we worry too much about all that, then we're missing the main point. And the main point is this. Genesis is giving us a theological explanation, not a scientific explanation. It's about God's history, not natural history. It's telling us important truths about God and important truths about us. Because Genesis is concerned with why the world was made and who made it, not in precisely how it was made in a manufacturing sense. And in fact, the Hebrew word for made is never used in the Bible anywhere in that sense. It means bringing something into being. That's the same sense in which it's used in Psalm 51 when David says, "Create in me a clean heart, O God." Bring it into being, make it happen. So let's have a quick look at Genesis, Genesis chapter 1, verse 31, continuing on to the next verse, which is Genesis 2:1. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning the 6th day. We would say morning through to evening, of course, but in Hebrew thinking, a day starts with the evening. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the 7th day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the 7th day, he rested from all his work. And this passage, says the writer to the Hebrews, is telling us something important about this special rest that God has for us. The Sabbath is another picture he's giving us. Very Vineyard again. And we know that this special rest is ready and waiting for us, says Hebrews, because of the place in the scriptures where it mentions the seventh day, Genesis 2:1. So what do we learn about this special rest from the place where it mentions the seventh day? On the seventh day, God rested from his work as creator. But we've already seen that the writer to the Hebrews isn't just talking about a physical day of rest in the sense of a literal Sabbath. He's saying something more than that. He's just using it as a picture. In Genesis 2, and this is why he refers them to it, there's something different about the seventh day to the days that come before it. The seventh and final day of creation is the only one that doesn't have an end. Every other day, in Genesis 1, it says there is evening and there is morning, but not the seventh day on which God rested. This special rest that God intends for us is not to be a place that we come into one day a week and then go out again the day after. This special rest that God has for us is a place where we're invited to live permanently. It's a rest that should characterize how we live every day of every week. That is the kind of rest that we're being invited into. And it's the kind of rest that is characteristic of God himself. It's the rest that he entered into on the seventh and final and continuing day of creation that he invites us to share in with him, imitating the Creator, living like he does. You never see God getting stressed. You never see God getting anxious or worrying. You never see God behaving like a workaholic. So come and be like me, says the Lord. Come and enter into my rest, the rest that I prepared for you to share in ever since the creation of the world. Does that sound like good news? It's not surprising because the Greek word that's translated gospel is the one that's used in Hebrews 4, verse 2. Entering into this special rest that God has prepared for us is part of the gospel. We just have to say yes to Jesus to enter into it. Or perhaps a better way of putting it is that we say yes to Jesus to have it enter into us. So how do we know what it looks like to live in this special kind of rest that God has for us? Well, we already know that Jesus, the Jesus of the New Testament, is the one who brings it to us. And we already know that living in the good of this rest is the way that God lives. It's characteristic of being like him. So who is the supreme example of what being like God looks like as a human being? Jesus. If you want to know what it looks like to live in this special kind of way, look at Jesus, or consider Jesus, as it says in Hebrews 3:1. See, living in God's divine kind of rest is part of becoming like Jesus by the life-changing power of the Holy Spirit. It's part of the fruit of his presence in our life. Let's have a quick look in the New Testament at Matthew chapter 11, and we'll close with this. Matthew 11, 28 to 30. Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." It's interesting here that Jesus uses a picture himself, an agricultural picture, and he likens living in this divine rest to being yoked to him. Now, a yoke was a wooden frame that joined two animals together when they were working. Usually it was oxen, and usually they were pulling a heavy load. And in Jesus' day, it was already being used as a metaphor for Torah, the various commandments in the Jewish law that God had given Israel to define what it means to live right. Following the commandments was how you knew you were right with God. But Jesus says, be yoked to me instead. Say yes to your life being joined to mine. says Jesus. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Does that kind of rest sound like something you need in your life? I certainly do. So I would invite us to say yes to Jesus this morning. You see, this special rest that God has for us isn't a feeling or a state that God sort of sends us in some way. No, it's the presence of a person. It's the presence of Jesus. Like so many other things that God has for us, we don't seek after the thing itself. We just seek after Jesus. John Wimber said, talking about seeking the power of the Holy Spirit, we don't seek God's power, we seek his presence. His power and everything else that we need is always found in his presence. So whatever it is that you need, whatever it is, you need the presence of Jesus in your life. And everything else flows from that.